I realized my son's apology was never about forgiveness the moment I saw the envelope shaking in his hands. My name is David Collins. I'm 56 years old, and this is the story of how my son's grand gesture of apology hid an agenda that nearly cost me everything I had left. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. The day started quietly, too quietly, in hindsight. It was a Sunday morning in early spring, the kind where sunlight spills through the windows and tricks you into believing things are finally settling down. I was in the kitchen, nursing my second cup of coffee, when I heard the knock. 3 slow knocks, careful, hesitant. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, my son Mark stood there holding a bouquet of flowers, my late wife's favorite liliand, a large, neatly wrapped box under his arm. He looked thinner than I remembered, older, too. Guilt does that to a person. Dad, he said softly, can I come in? That single word hit me harder than I expected. Not since the night he stormed out after we said things that can't be unsaid. I stepped aside without answering. Mark walked in slowly, like he was afraid the house might reject him. He looked around the living room, eyes lingering on the family photos still lining the shelves. His mother's picture sat front and center, smiling the same gentle smile she always wore when she was trying to keep peace between us. I brought these for Mom, he said, placing the lilies carefully beneath her photo. His voice cracked just enough to sound real. I know it's late. It's never late, I replied, my tone flat. What do you want, Mark? He winced, but nodded, like he deserved the coldness. I want to apologize. That caught me off guard. Not because I wanted it, but because I'd stopped expecting it. I messed up, he continued, setting the box on the coffee table. I messed up badly. I've had a lot of time to think. Therapy, long nights. I know I hurt you. I know I walked away when you needed me. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorway. You didn't just walk away. You accused me of stealing from your mother's estate. Mark swallowed. I know, and I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. He slid the box toward me. This is part of me trying to make things right. I stared at it, suspicious. What is it? A gift, he said quickly. Something meaningful. I didn't touch it. After my wife, Ellen, died, Mark changed. Grief twisted him into someone I barely recognized, angry, suspicious, convinced everyone was out to cheat him. When the lawyer read Ellen's will, Mark exploded, claiming I'd manipulated her, that I'd hidden money, that the house should have been his. He dragged me through months of accusations before disappearing completely. So forgiveness didn't come easy. I'm listening, I said, but I'm not opening anything yet. Mark nodded again, a little too quickly. That's fair. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick, official looking. There's more, he said. This is important. My stomach tightened. What is it? He hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. I almost missed it. It's paperwork, he said, about Mom's estate. I found some things I didn't understand before. I think we need to sign a few documents together, just to clean things up. There it was, the first crack. I didn't answer right away. I studied his face, the way his eyes avoided mine, the way his fingers gripped the envelope too tightly. What kind of paperwork? I asked. Just formalities, he replied. My lawyer said it's easier if we handle it now. It'll give both of us peace of mind. My lawyer, not ours. Mark, I said carefully, You don't bring legal documents to an apology. His jaw tightened. I'm just trying to move forward. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I finally sat down, gesturing for him to do the same. Start from the beginning. Why now? He exhaled, rubbing his hands together. Because I realized how wrong I was. Because I miss my dad. Because Mom wouldn't want us like this. He knew exactly which buttons to press. Ellen's name always softened the room. But I didn't miss the way his eyes flicked to the envelope again. I lost my job, he added quietly. I'm struggling. And I thought, maybe we could reset together. I felt the pull of it. The instinct every parent has to protect their child, even when that child has burned them. Still, I didn't open the box. I didn't touch the envelope. Leave the papers, I said. If they're legitimate, I'll have my lawyer look at them. His head snapped up. Too fast. Dad, that's not necessary. That was the moment my doubt hardened into something colder. Everything involving money is necessary, I replied. The room went silent again. Mark forced a smile. Of course, I just thought, this could be a fresh start. Maybe it could have been. But as he stood to leave, I noticed something that made my heart sink. The return address on the envelope wasn't his. It belonged to a firm I'd never heard of. And that was when I realized my son's apology wasn't about healing old wounds. It was about opening new ones. And whatever he was trying to make me sign, he didn't want me to read it too closely. Not yet. After Mark left, the house felt heavier than it had in years. Not louder, just dense, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I stood by the front window and watched him walk to his car, the same blue sedan he'd driven since college. He hesitated before getting in, glanced back at the house like he was hoping I'd change my mind and call him back. I didn't. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I locked the door and leaned my forehead against the wood. My hands were shaking, not from anger, least not entirely, but from the old instinct that had never left me. The instinct to protect my son, even when every warning bell in my head was screaming. I went back to the living room and stared at the box he'd left behind. It was wrapped carefully, almost reverently, in brown paper tied with twine. The kind of effort you make when you want something to look sincere. I sat down slowly and opened it. Inside was a framed photograph, an old one, Ellen and me at the lake, taken nearly 25 years ago. She was laughing, hair blown wild by the wind, her arm looped through mine. I remembered that day clearly. Mark had been 6, running up and down the dock, shouting every time he caught a frog. Tucked behind the frame was a folded letter. My throat tightened as I opened it. Dad, I know I've said terrible things, things I can't take back. Losing Mom broke something in me, and instead of dealing with it, I blamed you. I see that now. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to make things right. It was well written, careful, emotional, without being over the top, too careful. I set the letter down and reached for the envelope. Up close, it looked even more official, cream-colored paper, embossed logo, dense legal text visible through the flap. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I turned it over again and searched the return address on my phone. The firm existed. Barely. A small legal consultancy, incorporated less than 8 months ago. No website beyond a generic landing page. No listed partners. No reviews. That didn't sit right. I finally opened the envelope. Inside were several documents clipped together, headed with words that immediately raised my blood pressure. Estate amendment. Property transfer authorization. Power of attorney limited. I felt cold. I read more carefully this time, forcing myself not to jump to conclusions. The language was dense, intentionally so, but the more I read, the clearer it became. Mark wasn't just asking to clean things up. He was asking me to sign over partial control over the house, over remaining assets tied to Elon's estate. And buried deep in paragraph 6 was a clause granting him temporary but renewable authority to act on my behalf in matters deemed financially necessary. Temporary had quotation marks around it in my mind. I pushed the papers away like they burned. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every moment from the past 2 years, the arguments, the accusations, the way Mark's anger had always seemed fueled by something more than grief. I remembered the way he'd demanded copies of bank statements, the way he'd insisted on being present during meetings with the estate attorney. At the time, I thought it was entitlement. Now I wondered if it had always been planning. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Susan Ramirez. She'd helped Ellen and me draft our wills years ago and had stayed on through probate. She listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, she exhaled sharply. "David, I'm glad you didn't sign anything." "So am I," I said. "Tell me straight, what is this?" "An attempt," she replied, "to gain leverage. Not illegal on its face, but predatory, especially given the history. Could it have worked if you'd signed?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, it would have." My stomach dropped. Susan paused, then added, "There's something else." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What?" "These documents weren't prepared by a neutral firm. They're structured to benefit one party disproportionately, your son." I closed my eyes. She continued, "David, has Mark mentioned financial trouble recently? He said he lost his job." "That aligns with what I'm seeing," she said. "There are liens tied to his name, creditors, pressure. So he came to me." "Yes," she said softly, "not as a son, as an opportunity." That word hurt more than I expected. Opportunity. When I hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the lilies Mark had brought. One petal had already started to brown. I thought about Ellen, about how fiercely she loved Mark, about how she'd believed in, till the end, that he'd find his way back. I wanted to believe that too, but belief doesn't protect you from consequences. That afternoon, Mark texted me, "Did you get a chance to look at the papers?" I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "Yes," I typed. "We need to talk." 3 dots appeared immediately. "Good," he wrote. "I'm glad. I really think this can help both of us." I set the phone down, because now I knew the truth. This wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation. And the next conversation we had would determine whether my son still saw me as his father, or just the last obstacle standing between him and what he wanted. Mark came back 2 days later. This time there were no flowers, no box, just him standing on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, jaw tight, eyes alert in a way that told me he'd already decided how this conversation would go. I let him in anyway. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where Ellen used to insist we eat together every Sunday, no matter how busy life got. The silence between us felt deliberate, like a chessboard waiting for the first move. "You talked to a lawyer," Mark said finally. "Not a question." "Yes," I replied. "I did." He nodded slowly. "I figured you would." I watched him carefully. There was no guilt on his face now. no softness. Whatever mask he'd worn during his apology had slipped, replaced by something colder, more focused. She told me exactly what those papers do, I continued, and what they were designed to do. Mark leaned back in his chair. Dad, you're overreacting. No, I said evenly. I'm finally reacting appropriately. He exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across his face. You always do this. You assume the worst about me, because every time I give you the benefit of the doubt, I replied, you prove me wrong. That landed harder than I expected. His eyes flicked away for just a second before returning to mine. Look, he said, lowering his voice, I wouldn't be here if I had other options. There it is, I said quietly. There what is? The truth. Mark's shoulders tensed. I'm in trouble, Dad, I know, I said, but that doesn't give you the right to manipulate me. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table. Manipulate you? I'm asking for help. No, I corrected him. You're asking for control. His jaw clenched. You don't need control over everything. And you don't need power of attorney over your father's life, I shot back. That did it. Mark stood up abruptly, chair scraping loudly against the floor. You don't get it. You never have. Then explain it to me, I said, not raising my voice, without lies. He paced once, then stopped, fists clenched. I'm drowning, okay? I made bad decisions. I trusted the wrong people. I invested in things that went south. And every door I knock on gets slammed in my face. And you thought I'd be different. I thought you'd help, he snapped. I would have, I said. If you'd just asked. He stared at me, disbelief written all over his face. You're telling me you'd just hand me money. I'm telling you, I said slowly, that I would have helped you make a plan. I would have supported you, but I would not have signed away my autonomy because you wrapped it in an apology. Silence fell again. This time, Mark didn't fill it right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, bitter. Mom would have understood. I felt that like a slap. Don't, I warned. She would have known I needed this, he insisted. She always took my side. She took your side when you were honest, I said. Not when you were scheming. His eyes burned. You think I'm some kind of villain. I think you're desperate, I replied. And desperation makes people dangerous. That word hung between us. Dangerous. Mark laughed, but there was no humor in it. So what now? You cut me off. I protect myself, I said. And I protect what your mother worked her whole life to build. He shook his head slowly. You're choosing money over your son. I stood up then. No. I'm choosing boundaries over betrayal. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, father and son, divided by more than a table, by grief, by resentment, by choices neither of us could undo. Finally, Mark grabbed his jacket. You'll regret this, maybe, I said. But I won't regret keeping my eyes open. He paused at the door, hand on the knob. This isn't over. I know, I replied. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. I sat back down slowly, heart pounding. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that he'd cool off, reconsider, come back ready to be honest. But something deep in my gut told me otherwise. Mark hadn't come for forgiveness. He'd come for leverage. And now that he knew I wouldn't give it willingly, I feared he'd try to take it another way. I gathered the documents, placed them in a folder, and locked them in the safe Ellen and I used to keep together. That night, I barely slept, not because I was afraid of losing money, but because I was afraid of losing my son all over again, this time not to grief, but to something far more dangerous. Because when someone believes they're owed something, they don't always wait for permission to claim it. The next week passed in uneasy quiet. Mark didn't call, he didn't text, he didn't show up again. On the surface, life returned to its routine: morning coffee, slow walks around the neighborhood, evenings spent watching television I barely paid attention to. But underneath it all, something felt coiled and waiting. Silence, I've learned, can be more threatening than anger. On Thursday afternoon, Susan called me. "David," she said, skipping pleasantries, "have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any letters, emails, notifications?" My chest tightened. "What kind of unusual?" "Anything related to your accounts, your property, your credit?" I stood up slowly. "Why?" "I ran a routine check after our last conversation," she said, "and something flagged. Someone attempted to initiate an inquiry into your assets." I closed my eyes. "Mark, I can't say for certain yet," she replied carefully. "But the request was made using information only a close family member would know." The room felt suddenly smaller. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means he may be trying another angle," she said. "Not through you but around you." After we hung up, I logged into my bank accounts, my email, everything I could think of. At first glance, nothing looked wrong. Balances were intact, no unfamiliar transactions. Then I checked my email spam folder. That's where I found it. An automated message from my bank, sent 3 days earlier, warning of a failed attempt to reset account credentials. The security questions had been answered incorrectly twice. Security questions only Mark would know. I felt a slow, sick realization settle in. He wasn't just asking anymore. He was trying to force the door. I called Susan back immediately. "What do I do?" "First," she said, "we lock everything down. New passwords, new security questions, freeze your credit. Second," she hesitated, "you need to prepare yourself emotionally." "For what?" "For the possibility that this escalates." That night, I didn't sit in the living room. I went into Elon's old study instead, a room I'd barely touched since she died. The shelves still held her books, her notes, her neat handwriting frozen in time. I sat at her desk and stared at the surface, remembering how she used to sit there late at night, balancing the checkbook, planning holidays, worrying about Mark even when he was grown. She always believed in second chances. I wondered what she'd say now. The answer came sooner than I expected. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from Mark. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at my name printed neatly on the envelope, my hands cold. Eventually, I took a breath and tore it open. Inside was a formal notice. He was contesting parts of Elon's will, claiming undue influence, claiming I'd manipulated her during her illness, claiming the estate settlement was unfair. My vision blurred as I read. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was war. I called Susan, my voice steady but hollow. "He's contesting the will." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was afraid of that. Does he have a case?" "No," she replied firmly. "But he can make things expensive, painful, public." Public. The word echoed in my mind. I thought of neighbors, friends, the quiet life Ellen and I had built, the reputation I'd spent decades earning. All of it suddenly felt fragile. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. "Mark." I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. "Hello," I said. "You got my letter," he said flatly. "Yes?" "Good," he replied. "Then you understand. I'm serious." "I always understood that," I said. "I just hoped you wouldn't do this," he scoffed. You left me no choice. You always have a choice, Mark. Not when someone's standing on your throat, he snapped. I wasn't, I said. I offered help. You wanted control. A pause. Then his voice softened dangerously so. This doesn't have to get ugly, Dad. You could still sign the papers. End this. I closed my eyes. And if I don't, then we let the courts decide, he said. And everyone finds out how you treated your grieving son. The threat was clear. I felt anger rise, but beneath it was something else. Clarity. Mark, I said quietly. Your mother would be ashamed of this. He went silent. For the first time, I continued, I see what she was afraid of. Not that you'd fail, but that you'd believe you were owed everything. His breathing was audible now. You think you're teaching me a lesson, he said. You're just proving you never cared. That's not true, I replied. I care enough to stop enabling you. The line went dead. I set the phone down and sat there, staring at nothing. I knew then that whatever happened next would change our relationship forever. Because Mark had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And the most painful truth of all was this. My son wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for inheritance. And if he couldn't get it willingly, he was willing to tear everything apart to take it. The court date was set for 6 weeks later. 6 weeks of waiting. 6 weeks of silence from Mark. 6 weeks where every memory I had of him, his childhood laugh, the way he used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives with the man he'd revealed himself to be. I prepared myself for the worst. Susan and I gathered everything. Medical records from Ellen's final months. Videos of her clearly explaining her wishes. Emails she'd sent to both of us, spelling out exactly how she wanted her estate handled. There was no ambiguity. No manipulation, just a woman trying to take care of the people she loved. Still, I barely slept. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my tie, hands steady in a way my heart wasn't. I wasn't afraid of losing the case. I was afraid of what winning would cost me. Mark was already seated when I entered the courtroom. He didn't look at me. He looked thinner, sharper. Like someone who'd been living on adrenaline and resentment alone. When our eyes finally met, there was no anger in his flash, just calculation. The hearing lasted less than an hour. That was all it took. Susan presented the evidence, calmly, methodically. Ellen's video testimony played on the screen, her voice clear, firm, unmistakably her own. I am making these decisions of my own free will, Ellen said in the recording. I trust David completely. This is what I want. I watched Mark flinch. When his attorney tried to argue undue influence, the judge shut it down quickly. There was no legal ground, no proof, just accusations fueled by entitlement. The ruling was swift, case dismissed. Mark lost, not just legally, but definitively. Outside the courthouse, Mark finally turned to me. For a moment, he looked like my son again. Just a moment. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. I didn't, I replied. You did. He shook his head, jaw tight. You chose this. No, I said, meeting his eyes. You chose to lie. You chose to threaten. You chose to turn an apology into a weapon. His eyes flickered with something like regret, but it vanished quickly. You won, he said bitterly. Congratulations. This was never about winning, I said. It was about trust, and you broke it. He laughed hollowly. Trust doesn't pay bills. No, I said. But it keeps you human. He turned away then, walking down the courthouse steps, without another word. That was the last time I saw him in person. In the weeks that followed, I made changes I should have made sooner. I updated my will, tightened every account, put safeguards in place, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I also wrote Mark a letter, not to accuse, not to threaten, not to beg, just the truth. I told him I loved him, that I always would, but that love didn't mean surrendering my dignity, my autonomy, or my wife's legacy. I told him the door to reconciliation wasn't locked, but it would only open with honesty, accountability, and time. I never heard back, and that hurt more than the lawsuit ever could. But something unexpected happened too. I felt lighter. Not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped living in denial. I stopped excusing behavior that harmed me. I stopped confusing guilt with responsibility. Ellen once told me, years ago, loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy you. I finally understood what she meant. Mark's apology had been grand, emotional, carefully crafted, but apologies aren't measured by words. They're measured by what someone asks for afterward, and his ask had revealed everything. Today, my life is quieter, smaller in some ways, but it's honest, peaceful, built on boundaries instead of fear. I still hope Mark finds his way back, not to my money, not to my house, but to himself. Until then, I hold on to what I know to be true. Love without limits can become dangerous. Forgiveness without accountability becomes permission. And sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is say no, even to their own child.